Great. Well, it is 3 o'clock here on the West Coast, and I think, 9 a.m. for you, Barry? So we'll get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Connection, Camaraderie, Community, Lessons from the Men's Shed Movement. And before we start, I would like to first tell you who I am. My name is Barbara McMillan, and I'm part of the Men's Sheds Canada team. I'm joining you from Horseshoe Bay in West Vancouver in the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Horseshoe Bay, by the way, is known as Chaksay, which is sizzling in the Squamish language, the noise made from the plentiful herring in this area. Before we begin, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the homelands of all Indigenous people in this place that we now call Canada, and honor the many territorial keepers of the lands on which we work and live. So before we start, a few housekeeping details. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's about 150 registered. So we are expecting a very large number today, probably close to 100. Men's Shed members, community organizations, seniors agencies from across Canada, as well as a few folks from other countries. So welcome everyone. And of course, with this number, everybody except the presenters will be muted and cameras off. I was going to ask you to introduce yourself in the chat and say where you're joining from, but unfortunately the chat is not functioning now. But you can use the Q&A area, and that's where you'll also be posting questions. And so my colleagues will be screening the Q&A to look for questions to ask the presenters. There'll be 2 brief opportunities for Q&A, one after Barry presents and then another after Robert and Andy present. The session is being recorded and it will be posted on the Men's Shed Canada website within a few days. I'm hoping the closed captioning is also working, and to get that, you would click the show captions button and select. So today's session will focus on evidence-based research on the positive health impacts of men's sheds that have been compiled and contributed to or by Dr. Barry Golding, and we'll also introduce Men's Sheds Canada research agenda. And Dr. Golding literally wrote the books on men's sheds, and so we're really pleased to give away a copy of each of his each of the 2 books on men's sheds to one lucky participant who will get both books. And we'll select a name in a random draw of those who are online throughout the webinar. And then we'll announce their name at the end of the session and get their contact information. So that's enough for me for now, and I'd like to turn things over to our president of Men's Sheds Canada, Dr. Robert Golick, who will introduce Barry, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you, Barb. I want to echo your welcoming comments to everybody on behalf of Men's Sheds Canada board and staff. We're very pleased that you're able to join us. Before I introduce Barry, I just want to say a quick hello to Mark Winston, who's the president of the American Men's Shed Association. Mark, it's nice to have you with us, and we'll talk soon. Okay, Barry, what a personal joy and privilege it is for me to welcome and introduce you. Those of you who attended our inaugural provincial MSABC conference in Squamish, British Columbia, that happened in 2021, will recall that Barry was our keynote speaker and contributor to the success of our conference. We had great memories of that conference. Barry, again, thanks for spending your time with us at that conference. So Dr. Golding is a distinguished, widely published adult and community education researcher with Federation University Australia. He's known for his extensive work on the men's shed movement around the world. Barry has more than 100 international research publications and has published 2 books on the evolution of the men's shed movement. And believe me, I refer to those books frequently, and I have them with me right in front of me over here. So Barry, thanks for doing those 2 great books, one in 2015 and another one in 2021. Barry was awarded the Order of Australia in 2016 in recognition of his significant contributions to tertiary education, to professional organizations, and to the community. In his enjoyable spare time, and it's hard to believe that he has spare time because he's always focusing on Mensched, guess what he does? He's a mountain biker, as I understand it. Barry has not only been exploring, the vast landscapes of Australia with his biking buddies, apparently affectionately known as the Erratics, but is about to, guess this, listen to this, launch his latest book. And it's a compelling storytelling journey through the eyes of 6 iconic mountains in southern Victoria. And I'm going to get a copy of that, Barry. Barry, we're going to have to invite you to Squamish, British Columbia, arguably amongst the best biking landscapes in the world. You got to try our place out here. So with that introduction, Barry, we're so happy that you have time to be with us today. And we look forward to your presentation. We'll have a question and answer period right after your presentation. So Dr. Golding, over to you.
Look, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to Mensched Canada for inviting me to do this. I'm delighted to do this. It's a huge joy to be able to give back. As I said to Barbara and Robert before we started the session, Mensched's Australia's gift to the world, and that's the way we regard it. And we're delighted when people take it up. Can I just echo what Barbara said about being on First Nations country? I'm also on First Nations country here in Australia. I'm on Woiwurrung country, but I live on Djadjawurrung country, which is where the book that Robert has just talked about, which I've just published. And by the way, the book is published through the same publisher that the Mensched book comes through from.
Mm-hmm.
So those books that are on offer are actually coming from Illinois in the US, and that's where my latest book has recently been published. And it's good to also know that Mark Winston is online from Mensched's in the US. I do have to say, I was watching TV the other night, and there was a program about penny farthing bicycle racing, which happens here in Tasmania every year. And amongst other things, I was 3 times Australian penny farthing racing champion. I have to say now I'm less able on a penny farthing than I was. I just don't quite have the same nerve I had. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. Can I just acknowledge that Australia is the crucible of sheds in grassroots community settings? And I might ask you to go to the next slide, Barbara. Menscheds have now achieved movement status in 8 world nations, including Canada, and there's smaller numbers of sheds in 8 other nations. And that includes Canada, where I was 2 weeks ago looking at one of the 2 sheds that have recently opened there. And they are so enthusiastic, and they're looking for support, including from the US and from Canada, if you can give that to them. This is a community built shoulder to shoulder in the shed, but it's also a community built worldwide, shoulder to shoulder with the different movements. I'm totally delighted to see that men's sheds are actually, on my estimation, sheds are actually growing faster in Canada than anywhere else in the world. I'll show you some stats later, which confirms this. I acknowledge that adoption elsewhere, most recently in Japan, has huge potential, but clearly it will require national and local adaptation. The word men's shed doesn't necessarily translate into a lot of languages. So the slide you're looking at now gives you a brief summary of the way it works and the way it's unfolded. It's funny, I presented at the Australian Men's Shed Association conference just 2 months ago, and they introduced me, interestingly enough, as a men's shed historian, which I'm happy to be called, because I guess that's what my first book is. It's largely history of the movement. And it's only 31 years since the first ever shed for men opened in community settings in rural Australia. It was called The Shed. That's what it was called. I'll show you a picture of it in a sec. It's 26 years since the first ever men's shed opened. And at that point in 1998, people got confident enough to put the word men into it. And that's when it really started to go well. I'll just briefly say hi. The cleaner's just arrived in my son's house. I'll be out here. Just do what you need to do. It's a long story. Um, I acknowledge it's 15 years since the first Canadian men's shed opened in 2009 by Doug Mackey in Winnipeg, and Doug did a lot of the hard yards getting sheds started in Canada before Men's Shed Canada really took off a few years ago. But I just acknowledge his early pioneering work in Canada. About 14 years ago, women in Australia said, why can't we do this? And the first women's shed opened here in Australia in 2010. And by my estimation, we've probably got around 50 or 60 women's sheds opened here in Australia, in addition to the 1,300 men's sheds. Men's sheds have got such traction right across Australia. You can go to any small place and they know about it. Everyone knows what a men's shed is. Whereas in some parts of Canada, people would probably glaze over and say, what on earth is that? This is the first shed in the world. If you look really closely at that little rectangular sign, that actually says The Shed. And this was opened by a woman who was working in an aged care centre. And I'll explain the story in a sec. Next slide, thanks. So what happens in a men's shed? It's very diverse. There's no right way. It's mostly hands-on, although some sheds just have coffee. Some sheds just have a meal. It's about informally sharing skills and interests. It's with other men. It's in a safe and welcoming workshop type setting. But can I just say, and I've said this at quite a few conferences, and apologies if you heard me say this before, men's sheds aren't like McDonald's. They're all different. And you'll go into one men's shed and you'll think you've seen a men's shed. You'll go into another one, it'll look different. Friendship and companionship are probably the most important factor. And these things are encouraged over a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, a lunch, or whatever. Typically, a shed is open 1 or more days a week. There's some here in Australia which are open 7 days a week and also in evenings. Some of the small rural sheds might only open 1 day a week. In the process of coming together, men start to develop trust. They talk about themselves. They talk about their lives over shoulder to shoulder over a cup of tea. And what actually happens in Australia certainly is often woodwork. Sometimes it's metalwork, but it really can be whatever the men choose to do. It might be leatherwork, it might be crafts, it might be do-it-yourself, it might be tinkering with cars, it might be gardening, it might be potting plants. It doesn't matter what the activity is. And in some countries, the sharing of traditional crafts and customs is actually encouraged. And here in Australia, this on the screen is the first ever men's shed in the world, opened by Dick McGowan in July of 1998. Now, Dick was a very unwell man. He realised as he was dying in 1999 that he'd hit on something important and interesting. And he said, I think I've started something really important. I'm sorry I won't be able to see it. The good news is that his wife, who survived him, works every week in this shed 28 years later. She's the only woman allowed in the Tongala men's shed, and she is a craft worker She's made a full-sized Irish harp, and she turns exquisite pencils on a lathe. She's quite a lady. This is Ruth McGowan. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, I've given you a brief history. I'd like to give you a story about shed basics and why the model works, and tease out some implications. And I'd be interested to know how many people know this word on the screen. Do you know it, Barbara? Do you know it, Andy? Do you know it, Robert? No, I didn't until 10 years ago. So here's a new word for everybody. If you want to summarise what a men's shed is, it's salutogenic. It means health enhancing. So hospitals are places where you go to get fixed, and you might have therapeutic, medical type interventions. Men's sheds are places which by their nature are health enhancing. And it's a lovely word. It's a new word, but if you remember nothing else, take that word away. And if someone says, what is a men's shed? You say, it's salutogenic. I learnt the word from one of the other patrons in Australia who's a professor of men's health, Professor John McDonald. And when he says salutogenic, he says it with a Glaswegian accent. I can't do that. But it's a lovely idea. It's about reducing social isolation, and it's about reducing loneliness in later life. And can I just flag that we'll have questions later? How do I know about this stuff? As Robert said, I've been scratching around in this stuff for many years. I've done lots of work with people starting up national associations in all of those countries. I've written 2 books. I've been a patron of the Australian Men's Shed Association for 15 years. And recently, the Australian Women's Sheds Association said, will you be an ambassador, an advisor? And I said, well, if it's 10 times as much money as I'm getting from the Australian Men's Sheds Association, I'll also do it for nothing. So that's what I do. Next slide, please. So if we look at the way sheds have grown, these are the stats which I presented in my 2021 book. And you'll see there, I've listed the main countries up to 2021. This is 3 years ago. That was the number of sheds open in 2021. And you'll see in Canada, there was only 40 sheds open in Canada. I believe now you've got 100 more or less than that. Even in 2021, your sheds had grown by 900% in the 6 years between, well, in the 4 years between 2021 and 2025. But if you also have a look at the second country, Ireland, which in 2021 had 391 sheds, it actually had 83 sheds per million people. That's what's in the brackets in bold, compared to 51 sheds per million people. So men's sheds have actually had greater traction in Ireland than anywhere else in the world. But COVID hit everybody. I think in the US, some of the sheds that were opened or were opening stopped operating. Many sheds that were open in 2020 closed during COVID. Not quite as badly impacted here in Australia or New Zealand, but everywhere got hit fairly bad by COVID. And so some of these numbers went back. But we'll go on to the next slide, I think. Here's my most recent figures. So the tall number is the total number. The red total that's tapering off is Australia. There's about 1,300 sheds in Australia. That purple line that's gone up to meet the Australian line is the UK. And you can see that they're also growing very quickly. Now, Canada is the very small line down the bottom, but when you look at it in percentage terms, you're actually growing faster than anybody else in the world. It often starts from a slow base and it gets going quickly. And I use the parable of Aladdin and his lamp to explain this. I reckon what happens is someone rubs the lamp, rubs a shed, and another shed pops out. Someone rubs that shed and another shed pops out. So the growth is sort of exponential. It starts slowly, but once it gets going, it gets very quick, and then it tails off. I reckon your target of 1,000 sheds by 2034, which I'm told is feasible, and I reckon you'll probably get there. And if we can help you go there, good on you. Next slide, please. Here's the women's shed stats to 2021. I haven't got the up-to-date stats, but they've grown a little bit since 2021. This is the way things were 3 years ago. And they're also increasing quickly from a very low base. Next slide. I'd like to go back to why they started, because I think this tells the story of why they're spreading in other places. A lady went to a men's services conference in South Australia in 1986, and I got the proceedings of this conference. And the proceedings of this conference said many social phenomena classified as women's issues cannot be successfully addressed without including men in the solutions. And my contention is that many of the issues that men and women beyond paid work face can't be successfully addressed without including and empowering them in the solutions. And the three key things in all of this are self-esteem, self-efficacy, the ability to do stuff yourself, and self-determination, the ability to actually self-determine. And I'll come back to the research about this a little bit later. Next slide, please. Now, the lady who started this first shed she's been to several of our conferences. She started the first shed and then disappeared. I tracked her down while I was writing my 2015 book, and she thought I was trying to stalk her on Facebook. And her kids finally convinced her to respond to my attempts to contact her, because she didn't realise that what she'd started actually went and became a movement. But what she wrote in 1996, this is Maxine Kitto, now Maxine Chasling, she said, in those days, the vast majority of community health workers were women. She was running programs for women inside a aged care complex. She noticed that the women who were accessing the services in her programs were healthier than the men that were mating outside for the women to finish the programs. And she asked the question, what would I have to do to reach the men waiting in their cars rather than the women who were in my programs? And I thought that was a very interesting way of acknowledging that sometimes we reach people that we want to help, but they're not necessarily the people who most need the services. And in her case, she could see that a lot of men were really struggling. And she asked the question, what do I have to do to reach men? She also acknowledged, and this is a personal observation, she said, my dad's shed is where he continues his role as a handyman, the fixer, the craftsman, and where he goes to get away from it all. So she acknowledged this personally and also professionally. Next slide. So jump forward to 1998. Dick McGowan came up with this. As he was dying, he said, I think a men's shed is somewhere to go, something to do, and someone to talk with. And I think that also encapsulates how it works and why it works. And he also said it's about building on the daily achievements of companionship, a feeling of worth, physical activity, and a pride of accomplishment. So this is how it started, and this is really Jump forward to 2020. This is a PhD written here in Australia based on data which came from men's sheds by Deb Mulligan. She came to the conclusion that all older men must be given a choice to access an all-male environment at some stage in their week or their life that's both non-confrontational and welcoming. She said it should be democratic and it should be a place where a lifetime of knowledge and skills is appreciated. She also said that it should be a community that values wisdom that's inherent in ageing and that does not pathologise or negatively stereotype older men. And can I just observe here that one of the reasons why I think it'll work really well in Japan and Asia is because they have a Confucian society which respects elders more so than they do in many Anglo countries. Certainly in Australia, I don't see myself as being on the scrap heap, but some people regard being old as being on the scrap heap. And even 10 years ago in Australia, people would talk about dirty old men. You know, there are some very small numbers of dirty old men, but most men aren't dirty or dirty. They're like the men on the screen. We've got something to give, and we have got wisdom inherent in ageing. And we do want to be included, and we don't want to just disappear off the planet because we're over working age. And importantly, and the last point on the screen, it's an opportunity to connect with a community where they can be of service. She also said, on the next slide, these are the organisational characteristics of an organisation that might create this situation. And you'll see for any of those who are involved in a men's shed, this is the fundamentals of a men's shed. It's a male-only culture. It celebrates a form of masculinity, which is not negative or what some researchers call hegemonic. It's about being a bloke in a nice way, but also being respectful of women. It's not being misogynist. It's about providing a space for men, not for the whole week. And can I just observe here that sheds can become obsessive. There are some men in some Australian sheds that spend too much of their time in their sheds, and they won't fix the taps at home, and they won't do the cleaning, and they won't cook the meals, and they won't contribute to the household, and they spend the whole week in the shed. So my only caution here is don't get obsessive. If you're in the shed for the whole week, maybe you're trying to get away from something and you need to resolve it rather than to go to the shed to get away from it. Men's sheds are grassroots. They're bottom up, they're organisationally flat. Although someone's usually responsible, no one is going to tell you what to do. It's democratic. It's a place where the stereotype of ageing is ignored and where ageing is respected. It's about building the capacity of the community. It's about men's shedders. And I think in Australia we call them shedders. I'm assuming you do so similarly, Robert, in
Yes, we do.
Yeah, call them shedders. The only place where they don't call themselves shedders, by the way, is in New Zealand. It's a slight variation. They call themselves sheddies. New Zealanders and Australians have always, they love each other, but they also like to do things differently. And so when they actually use the term men's sheds, they actually put a Z in it, because if you look at the MENZ, it's got the initials for New Zealand in it. So around half of the men's sheds are called men's sheds, MENZ, and this is the New Zealanders saying they're not like Australians, where they're different and they want to do things differently. So this is just, and so the New Zealanders are sheddies. There's that new word I gave you before, salutogenic. It's about providing a supportive environment to promote health and well-being. Could I just note that I've thrown that one into Deb Mulligan's PhD. That wasn't in her PhD, but I've added it. And if you look on page 403 of my book, you'll see that I've actually added that into her recipe for what you need to create an organisation which is going to work for men's sheds. Next slide. Very importantly, let's talk about the role of public health professionals. It works best if the shed and what happens is driven by the men as participants and supported by the local community in the interests of men's health and well-being. But health professionals should play a hands-off role, helping and contributing when invited and when required. It's not the health professional's shed. They need to know when to step forward. They also need to know when to step back. And as Professor John McDonald, who's a professor of men's health, said here in Australia, the shed must not become the health professional's office. It's not the place for a welfare worker to work. It's not the place for a doctor to work. A doctor can come in and do stuff when invited and required, but it's not their office. It's also important to notice that researchers are welcome because data is really important and useful for governments and for NGOs, but they need to work with the shedders to collect the data in a respectful way and to give back. And this is really important because it's not the researchers' shed either. They can be invited in, but they need to be invited in on their terms. Next one, please. Next slide, please, Barbara. So now a couple of personal opinions. My personal opinion is that sharing skills across generations and staying independent and as long as possible are fundamental human rights and needs. This is a human rights issue. I also noticed personally that my late father and my late grandfather would have had far more enriching lives if men's sheds had been around then in my local community. Both my father and my grandfather retreated to their shed and were quite lonely and isolated in later life. And they would have had richer lives. I'm not doing this because of my late father and grandfather. I'm just acknowledging this is personal stuff. But a lot of this is about reducing social isolation in order to stay well physically and mentally. So it's about mental health too. So I'd like to show you, and I'll flick through a few images just to show you the way it works. And some of you will say, this is familiar to me. Let's look at some of the early sheds. Here's one, Barbara. This is one of the very early The Sheds. It was a community workshop and it was called The Shed. In 1995, they weren't going to put the name men into it. Let's go to the next slide. Also in South Australia, some health services early on weren't game to put the name men's shed in. Some sheds actually call themselves community sheds. This one called themselves Clem Shed. They called it Clem Shed because it used to be owned by Clem. No more complicated than that. But they decided they would honour Clem by calling it his shed. And you can see it was run through the health service. It was run as a war veterans drop-in centre. And it was also run as a work for the dole. It was for unemployed men. So you can see here there's layers of stuff. It's acknowledging local men. It's acknowledging they've got a health function. It's acknowledging as a drop-in centre for veterans. It's acknowledging it's for people beyond paid work. Next one. Here's one in suburban Adelaide, which was specifically for men with who used to be in the military. So this is people with post-traumatic syndrome. I did research interviews in this shed. Again, very early on, they weren't going to call it a shed. A men's shed. They just called it The Shed. They knew it was for blokes, but that's what they called it. Next one. So here's Ruth McGowan, Dick McGowan's widow, working in the men's shed in 2015. She is the most beautiful, amazing woman. and she's a lot less well than she shows in this photograph. That was 9 years ago, but she still goes to the shed. She still opens up. She still shuts down. She still makes the coffee, and she's still the only honorary bloke in the Tongala men's shed. It's a lovely story. Next slide. This is a shed I visited in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, and one in Belfast. In both of these areas, men were killing each other. Catholics were fighting Protestants. Nationalists were fighting Royalists. In these two sheds, men are working shoulder to shoulder that would have been killing each other 25 years ago. And these sheds were actually funded through the EU as a sort of a reconciliation activity. So sheds have an amazing ability to work in situations where you'd find it very hard to do a social program. Next slide. Here's sheds in Kerry in Ireland and in Belfast. And the one on the left-hand side is actually the Cloughlin Men's Shed Choir that sang when I arrived in the village late at night and ambushed me by singing a song that we well know in Australia called Bound for South Australia. I cried. I couldn't believe that this was happening. Next slide. Here's a shed in, next one. Here's a shed in, we just flicked over the one in Wales, and here's the first men's shed to open in Scotland. So, and you could show me sheds all around Canada. I don't need to show you sheds in Canada, but you could show me 140 different sheds. Can I just say something briefly about gender and sheds? And I know I'm going quickly, but I'm just making sure I've got some time for questions. Most sheds have been male gendered, but there are many ways of including women without necessarily impinging on the men as a male space. If you want to know how to do it, go to chapter 10 of my 2021 book, and I tell you how to do it. Lots of different ways. Lots of sheds which have been operating for a long time here in Australia have found that they've been revitalised by becoming a women's shed on 1 or 2 days a week, getting new blood into the shed, getting women on the committee, and changing the way they do things. I might flick over the next slide because it's just too much information. We'll leave that one, flick over. This is what Deb Mulligan said in her PhD, and this summarises what I talked about before. And this is in my book on page 403. It's about wisdom going around the circle. It's about feeling worthy. It's about feeling connected. It's about feeling wanted. It's about feeling valued. It's about being independent, autonomous, useful, and of service to the community. It's all obvious stuff, but Deb really nailed it, and I love her diagram. So feel free to use that. Just acknowledge it's Deb's work, and that's a PhD based here in Australia, based largely on men's shed. Let's go to the next one. I actually take out the word men, and I reckon that all older people need these things. All older people need to share wisdom and belong. All older people, men and women, need to feel worthy, connected, wanted and valued. All older people, men and women, need to be independent, autonomous, useful and of service as long as possible. So I think it goes beyond that. There are global opportunities to build on the movement we started in Australia. This is about empowering and connecting older women and men. But can I just note here, I get really put off when people talk about men as clients in men's sheds. I know that this is part of the professional speak. I will not use the term client, patient, customer, or student in relation to a men's shed. These aren't patients. These aren't customers. These aren't clients. These aren't students. These are participants in a shared activity. Call them participants, but call them shedders, but don't call them clients, because it patronises, and men don't like being patronised. Most older people don't like being patronised. It's about creating a community of practice, and you can do it in aged care and residential settings, not only in men's sheds. You can set up specialist sheds, as we do in Australia, just for men with dementia. It can just be for people with disability. It can be just for war veterans with post-traumatic syndrome. It can just be for women. It can be just for men. It can be a community shed. It can be standalone. It can be on separate days. It can be working in all sorts of ways. Eli's come to say hello because he reckons I must be nearly, he can sit on my knee. You have a look, Eli. He's very patiently sitting here in the background. This is my grandson. And it is intergenerational because you can see Eli's on the screen. It's about keeping people beyond paid work connected and well, and it's about ensuring that the wisdom of older generations is shared and passed on to future generations, like my son here, like my grandson here, little Eli. And you can see yourself, and all these people are in Canada, and they're going to ask some questions. So I've been very quick. You've been very patient with me. I'm happy to answer any questions. So let's go for it.
Sorry, I've been monitoring the questions. So wonderful, Barry. So many things come to my mind, but I'm going to respect that people have entered their questions in the Q&A. First one is about finding space in an urban setting where real estate is darned expensive. Do you have any, I know what we do in some cities in Canada. We got guys from Ottawa and Vancouver here, but what's your perspective on how you find space and identify it in urban settings?
Yeah, and you are right. Here in Australia, sheds do much better in country areas because there's so many spaces in little country towns that are disused. But if you try and find a space in inner suburban Melbourne, it's very difficult. And you're right. My advice would be to try and go to an organisation that does stuff that has already got a shed. It might be a car repairers society. It might be an agricultural society. It might be a museum, which may have a room out the back that they're not using, where they've got tools already and where they might be delighted for the shed to move into that space. I don't have an easy answer. I do know that if you're paying rent, as a lot of sheds in Ireland found, if you're paying rent in an urban setting and you get COVID or something happens, then your shed is going to go belly up very quickly when you have a problem. I don't have an easy answer, but I'd say put out a call and say, we need a place to go. There's guys in Perth who've actually been meeting in the same personal guy's garage on a Wednesday afternoon every day for 20 years. On that Wednesday, his wife goes out to play golf, and so there's an extra space in his car port, and they meet in the car in a personal garage every week, and they've been doing it for 20 years. But these are ex-war veterans who really need a space, and they're happy to do it. But I've got no simple answer, but I acknowledge the problem.
Thanks. And I should have said that was from Camille in Vancouver, where there's real estate is very expensive, but thank you. Next one is from David, a really great question about younger men. So there's a lot of younger men struggling. And his word is, how do you think it's possible for older shedders to help these younger men, or should we even attempt that? And this is about mentoring, right? And cross-generational work.
Yeah. Well, for a start, a lot of sheds are only open on weekdays.
Yeah.
And if you're only open on weekdays, that means that work can't come. I think sheds are found if they actually open at a different time. Some of them open for a meal, for an evening meal one night a week. And you'll get a different demographic who'll come and have a meal in the shed and do something between 6 and 8 o'clock at night. Or if you open on a Saturday morning. So some of it's about timing. Some is about the fact that the sort of situation that younger men want isn't necessarily to be with a lot of older blokes. And there's a few places here in Australia which are actually experimenting with sheds that are only for men under 50. Now, I don't think this is the total answer, but I think, in small rural towns, it just has to be for everybody, because you can't have a specialist shed. But in an urban setting, there's no reason why you can't have a young bloke shed. And it might be that the young bloke shed might have women in it as well, because a lot of young men don't mind having women around. And it's also about the activities that you do. If you've got a 3D printer, for example, or high tech type operation, rather than just a workshop with wood for older blokes. So I'd say change the activity, set it up differently, and maybe meet at a different time. But all communities are different. But that's my quick and dirty answer.
Great. So a leading question here from Patrick Abrahams in the UK. Why do you think there are so few academic or public health overall financial assessments of the socioeconomic benefits and return on investment of men's sheds? And that's particularly relevant here in Canada. We need to prove the case.
Yeah. Look, I think a lot of academics think that men's sheds is just fairies at the bottom of the garden. I don't believe this. I realised early on this was a very powerful model, and that's why I studied it. But, I think the other reason I think there's not a lot of research in this area is that men's sheds don't fit into an easy academic bucket. They're not just about learning. They're not just about health. They're not just about community development. They're not just about gerontology. They're not just about aging. They're not just about dementia. They're not just about disability. They're not just about, you know what I'm saying? You can define them in all sorts of ways. It's a bit like the analogy, how people say if you put a blanket over an elephant and you put your hand through the blanket, you'd come up with a different answer about what the creature was under the blanket, depending on what you actually touched through the blanket. Yeah. And so men's sheds are different according to which bits you're looking at and how you look at it. I looked at them from an adult learning perspective, but they can be studied in all sorts of ways, but they don't lend themselves easily to being studied in a simple way. And I think that's part of the problem. They don't fit well into an academic box. They do all these things, but they do it together. That's my short answer.
Thank you. So
and the economists probably don't know anything about them. We need to educate economists too.
Yeah. Great. Dan from Smithers is really supportive of what you said about including females in the group, and that there's a lot of females who need some support, and they struggle with isolation. What's your take on how does that impact the shed when you have women involved? Yeah, we all need help, but these are men's sheds for men. And how does this thing when you include women?
Okay, I'll go to the research. The research basically shows that the men who are most disadvantaged and having most difficulty in their lives are least likely to want to have women in their lives at that time. If men have got issues with erectile dysfunction or with having a leak, with their mental health, with their relationships, sometimes men don't want women in their lives at least some time during the week. What we find is that there's no reason why, if a men's shed is only open 3 days a week for men, why can't it be open 2 days a week when the men aren't there, using the same tools in the same space, without impinging on the men who have that space? So my answer is, it doesn't mean that you have to have women in the shed at the same time. It just means you have to be a bit creative about how you do it. And so there's no right way, but my long answer is go to my chapter in in my book in 2021, and I've got all sorts of models there of how to do it. And there's all sorts of ways that we know they work.
Thank you. And so we're running a little short on time, and there's a number of detailed questions that we could answer offline, but there's one that's kind of a bigger question from Doug Taylor in Spruce Grove. What do you see as the work of an ambassador in starting sheds? Or just, sorry, I limited that. His question is, can you summarize the work of an ambassador in the men's sheds context?
I guess I would say it's about being an informed advocate, advocate and activist. I think if you can find an academic who understands why it works, and I would argue I understand how it works, you're probably well on the way. But if you can find anybody who's got a high profile, I can say this: we made a mistake here in Australia by appointing a patron who was the partner of our first female Prime Minister. And although that was good politically, it turned out that he wasn't necessarily the best man for the job. And he ended up in recent years in court for fondling a woman's breast. I can say that because it's publicly known, but you have to be very careful about who you select, and you have to select someone who's going to be in there for the long haul, who's going to be good publicly. I guess that's what I'm saying. What I've said is all publicly known, but I'm just saying it has to be somebody who's well known, respected, and who's well informed. And I guess my job, and of course you need to make lots of money. As everyone will know, I'm making loads of money from doing this webinar. I said when I came on, when they said there was 150 people coming on, I said I'm expecting to be paid by numbers. That's my joke, guys. I'm an ambassador. I never get paid for doing anything for men's sheds. If I go to a men's shed conference, they will sometimes give me an airfare and they'll put me up, but they don't pay me. This is voluntary stuff. And in the end, an ambassador has to be available to do stuff gratis in a way that's useful to the shedder community. But I do think having an ambassador is a good idea, and even your state association should have probably a patron and an ambassador. The patrons are usually a bit older. I mean, I'm 74. If you can get an ambassador, try and get an ambassador that's going to live longer than me, because I might only last another 10 years. Find a 40-year-old ambassador that plays a good Canadian sport. Get someone like Eli. I reckon Eli here, who's on my knee, I reckon he'd be a good. You reckon you'd be a good ambassador?
No.
No. No.
So much, Barry. There's a number of other questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to answer them. But we'll also, if we need to forward them to you later, we can do that. But I think we're out of time for the questions. And there was one. So if anybody else has a QA, please put it in there. But back to you, Barb.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Barry. And I'm going to share my screen again for a few more slides, but I'm wondering, Barry, if you can give us an extra 5 minutes after the hour, because there's some really thoughtful questions, and it would be great if you could answer them. So great. So if and you too, Eli. So if there's participants who
we go for another
after the hour, we would love to get to all of these questions.
No problems.
So I'm going to hand it back over to Robert now.
All right. Well, I think I speak for everyone, attending our session here to thank you for your insightful and engaging presentation, Barry. We know your contributions to the field and your dedication to improving lives through education and community building are truly inspirational. And again, we appreciate the time you have taken to share your knowledge and vast experience on men's sheds with us today. So thank you very, very much for that. Okay, I guess I've been asked to just give you a very, very quick update on MenSheds Canada's activities. I'm going to keep it very brief. I'll only focus on 4 or 5 things and turn things over to Andy, who has a piece on research. Well, like many MenShed missions, ours is very simple, very clear, and very compelling. It's to grow and strengthen the MenShed movement right across Canada. We're very dedicated to creating a supportive environment where men can connect, share skills, and improve their overall well-being. Many sheds are all about that, and we are no different. Barry mentioned, how remarkable growth we are experiencing, and it's not a mistake. We have about 130 sheds across Canada in 10 provinces now, and we are thankful to our partners, the provincial associations, for example, our individual sheds, and our other partners. And we thank them for their dedication and passion to start and strengthen our sheds across Canada. We right now have 4 provincial associations in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Manitoba, and currently working on establishing 2 more, one in Quebec. And I know Andy and Jill and Robert Elham were working very hard today in the province of Quebec on doing just that. And our provincial leaders like Jan Fenema from British Columbia and Fred Grabowski from Manitoba, and John Peters and Nick Fry from Ontario, and finally Punch Jackson. Those are our provincial leaders who are making all kinds of great things happen in the MenShed movement, and we are because of their great energies and their passion for creating MenSheds in their provinces. And of course, we couldn't do all of that without funding, and so we are extremely grateful, to have secured multi-year funding from Walton's Trust. This support is critical, and so as we set our sights to a really ambitious goal. And as I think Barry pointed out, we want to achieve about 1,000 sheds, but by about 2032, maybe 33, 34. So we are going to, expand our efforts in that direction. And technology is another issue that we are focusing on these days. We have to recognize it's important in today's world, and we're working hard to enhance our infrastructure. These improvements, we're hoping, will benefit not only our organization, but also individual sheds. What we want to do is make it easier for us to communicate, to collaborate, and to grow together. And again, I want to acknowledge the efforts of Robert Elham, our Quebec director, who spends more than 5 hours a week on IT stuff and is really helping us to get to places where we want to be. I want to say a word about charitable status. Unfortunately, we have submitted our application months ago, still waiting patiently for a decision from the Canadian Revenue, from what do they call CRA, Revenue Canada Agency. We've been back and forth. They ask us questions, we respond, and we're still hopeful, but we've unfortunately hoped that we had a decision by now. So a little bit more patience, and maybe in the near future we'll hear from them. Lastly, I just want to say that we are working really hard to transition from a working board to a governing board. We're all volunteers at this point, and we with the funding that we received from Walton's Trust, we were able to hire some unbelievably experienced professionals who are helping us incredibly well in the direction that we want to follow. And with this, with the resources that we've been blessed with from Walton's Trust, we'll be able to focus more strategically on our long-term goals and focus on sustainability of our organization. We certainly want to thank Walton's Trust for their confidence in MenSheds Canada. I just want to really express my heartfelt thanks to our volunteer board members and to our staff who really helped us make a difference in the lives of many men across Canada. Couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you very much. That in a nutshell is where we're at. I know there are other initiatives that we have started, like the DEI initiative. We want to work with sheds across Canada to make them more representative of the demographics of the communities that they serve. We have a long journey ahead of us on that, but we will make an effort. And the other piece is that we want to establish an external advisory committee with notable Canadians who will lend us their names and their experience and knowledge to move forward, to move our men's shed movement forward. Okay, I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions later, I'd be happy to answer them, or you can write your questions if you want. And let me now introduce Dr. Andy Tamas, who is the Vice President of Men's Sheds Canada and a member of the Arnprior Men's Sheds. You probably heard of Men's Sheds, of Arnprior Men's Shed, with the Toy Story that CBC, CTV, and Global covered. They made toys for children whose homes were burnt. And a great story, and great work done by Arnprior Men's Shed. Andy's our board's lead on research activities, and he will speak on Men's Shed Canada's research priorities. So I'll turn things over to Andy.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think I have 30 seconds to fill in the blanks here.
We'll give you 2 minutes.
One of the things about the Walton Trust is that they want us to be sustainable. Their funding is not in perpetuity. And so we have to figure out how to become sustainable. And so we need to be able to do something similar to what the Australians did. And some time back, I sent Barry an email saying, how did you guys get your government to do a policy serving older men and to contribute from the public purse into dealing with these issues? And to summarize his response, he says there were 3 elements. One was research, the other was advocacy, and the third was serendipity. Well, we can't do much about serendipity. And advocacy is fine, but you need research to build a case. If you want to get a problem up above the action threshold, we need to do something about this as a state. You need to have evidence, hard evidence, which says this is a serious problem. And it's a long process. Like if you think in terms of, for instance, how the rape laws were changed to come into the criminal code, that was a 20-year process. So what we're talking about is a long-term policy development advocacy support system. We started in on it. We had cooperation from University of Alberta, MPH, public health folks. They went and looked at the policy framework across Canada, and they found 0 mention of issues related to meeting the needs of older men. Well, that silence speaks volumes. All right, so that was a sort of like a foundation. Since then, there's been a number of other initiatives, and we're currently launching a large national study. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there's a lot of small n number people that could say, okay, 25 guys in these 3 sheds were better off. That doesn't build a national case for policy. You need a much more robust set of information. And so there's a lot of information out there, but it's not collected in a way which it can be mined to extract evidence to support the policy agenda. We're entering into a relationship with University of Toronto, Mississauga, to create a men's shed research database. And we're going to be collecting research from all over Canada and elsewhere in the world to build a case so that this is something that is hard evidence that will hopefully move the need agenda further up the agenda. I'm sending this, speaking to you now from Quebec. We are in the middle of a meeting to form the Quebec Provincial Association. And Jill and I were in there today, and it's just really wonderful to be part of this and to help bring the thing into some kind of perspective, because we're, early on, it's early days in Canada on this, but we're trying to have a robust sort of approach to driving the policy agenda into action, and so we can have sustainable funding from the state. Because men's shed are worth every dollar you spend. Every dollar you spend on the men's shed probably saves you $20 in the healthcare system, in the social services system. But it's one thing to say this to your friendly politician, but it's another thing to prove it to the policy wonks that drive the thing. So our agenda here for the research is to see men's health as a item in the throne speech, and to see men's health support as a line item in the federal and provincial budgets. And that's what we're driving for. And Barry, your work has just really laid the groundwork and sort of shows us the path and the context, and it's absolutely wonderful. And thank you very much for your years of devotion to this cause.
Great. And I
I
would
don't know what else to say.
No,
thanks, Sandy. That was great. And thanks for that. And thank you, Robert. And I want to turn it back to some of the questions and answers. And I'm going to announce in just a moment the winner of Dr. Golding's 2 books. And I
if I
appreciate
win it, Barbara, I'll give it back.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. So the question, we'll look at the Q&A again. Brian's going to pull that up and pick out a couple of the remaining questions. But I also want to just remind people, actually, I need to go back to sharing because we want to make sure that if you are not already on our contact list, or have seen the new website for Men's Sheds Canada, you can access it through this QR code, or go to www.mensshedscanada.org, and you will see lots of information about men's sheds across the country. We feature stories, we feature profiles of shedders, and also some data, a compendium of men's health, and also the research on the efficacy of men's sheds, including Barry's and other researchers. So let's go back for a moment to the questions.
Yeah.
Could
So
I?
there was a few
I can see
technical.
one straight away. What relationships have you established with First Nations? I'm happy to take that one if you like.
Yeah. That's the one that's left over, and it's certainly an issue for us in Canada. And what's your experience, Gary?
There's men's sheds here in Australia which are just for First Nations men, particularly in. Having said that, some people argue that they should be, that if we're really about reconciliation, we should be working together. But I think there is a case in some communities here in Australia where, for example, where you've got a First Nations language which is spoken in a community, and you've got a large number of people in Northern or Central Australia which are all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. There's no reason why it can't be a men's shed just for, and some of the men here in Australia call it a yarning, the Aboriginal men call it a yarning space rather than a men's shed space, because it's a place where they can yarn. Yarning is a word that, I mean, it's an English word, but it's a word, it's also an Aboriginal word, yarning, the idea of chatting rather than, so it's a matter of tweaking the model, I think. It's interesting, in Japan, they've called one of the men's sheds, basically, they're calling it in an Ainu first language name, which basically means warm place. So I think there's a great potential for it, but it's not a matter of the men's shed movement doing it to the First Nations people. It's about forming partnerships with First Nations people and finding, it seems to me from first principles, it should work in Canada as well as other places. As you will know, wood carving is a traditional activity in many First Nations communities in Australia and the Pacific, and the Maori people in New Zealand. And there's no reason why you can't integrate that into a men's shed in some sort of creative way. So I think anything's possible, but it's a matter of working with First Nations people.
Yeah, so just one follow-up question. So have you got we could exist as two solitudes who kind of work from a distance. Any experience with integrating between Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous men's sheds where they started doing some cross-cultural work?
Yes, definitely. One of the sheds in Western New South Wales, the logo for the shed is actually a black hand and a white hand.
Mm.
So it's about symbolism. And in that shed, Aboriginal men and Gubba, as they might call non-Indigenous people, are doing stuff together. So I think it's about there's many possibilities. The difficulty is I can't give you a recipe. Every community is different.
Yeah, yeah.
I could take you to a city near where I live, which has got 5 men's sheds, and each one is different. One is for disadvantaged men who are ex-IV drug users and people who got carers. The other one is up the other end of town where there's men who used to be university lecturers. They've got a variety of different stuff in them, but they're totally different sheds simply because they're set up by different men in different areas for different needs. So no right way, not McDonald's.
Thanks. That's no outstanding questions that I can see, Barb. So back to you.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And thank you very much, Barry. All other questions, I know we didn't have time for Q&A with Robert and Andy, but people can just email questions and we will definitely get back to you. I want to announce now the first winner actually had to leave, it seems, but we won't keep anybody any longer. Thank you, everyone, for staying on past the hour. Next time, we would make this a 90-minute session for sure, because there's no shortage of questions and no shortage of things to talk about. So if Roger LeBlanc is still on, yes, and I think he is, Roger, we will get your mailing address so that we can send you the books. So hang on there, or if you can email it to us or put it in the Q&A, we will make sure that we get that to you. So again, thank you, everyone. Thanks to Barry in particular, and to Eli. Thank you, Eli, for joining us today. I guess it's morning there for you. And thanks to Robert and Andy and Brian and Jill, our other colleague. And thanks to all of you who participated and spent the time with us to learn more about men's sheds and ask some really great questions. And thank you for all the work that you do in community. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. And we will.
I would like to thank our wonderful staff for pulling this together. This is just a
right.
beautiful job that you folks have done. Thank you so much for this.
Look, can I just say, this is all, it's all done by volunteers. We've got the odd shed in Australia, which has got some paid, a paid staff member, but this is all done on the smell of an oily rag. It's done by generous, wonderful people, Barbara, Andy, Brian, Robert, people all over the world. And when I went to Japan, the guys in the shed there gave me a dinner. And they were just beautiful, beautiful men, just like in Canada, just like in, we might be old, but we can shine very, very brightly, and we can do so in a whole range of ways, including through men's sheds. So thank you to everybody for setting this up, and I'm happy to help and advise, and I'll always respond if people email me, not a problem. As I said, I'm looking forward to all the money from all of the people that have come on board today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Roger, I see your hand up. Stay online. I'll get in touch with you, or we'll talk to you. Either give me your email in the chat or I'll unmute you.
I'll go, Brian. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Barry.
Bye,
Bye,
Barry.
Eli.
Take
Bye-bye.
See ya.
So I'm just going to unmute Roger. I can find him. Where is he?
I think he's gone.
He's gone, but I've got his email. That's okay.
Great. Great. Okay, good. Okay.
At least I'm not sure. If I'm not sure, he's gone. Hang on. So,
It's usually alphabetical order. Oh, he's at the top now. There he is.
okay, there you are. Allow to talk. Okay. Roger, hopefully we can hear you. If you want to unmute.
I don't know how to do that.
You've done it. You've done it.
Oh, here we go. Yes, I'm still on.
Oh, good. Yep, can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, good. Excellent, excellent presentation. Anyway,
Great.
I'm at RogerLeb22, RogerLeb 22 at gmail.com. I'm in Ottawa.
Okay. And do you are you willing to supply me with your snail mail address right now?
Certainly. 11 Peregrine Crescent, Peregrine
Yep.
Crescent, Canada.
In where?
Well, I'll put Ottawa. It's we
Okay.
use a suburb here, but doesn't matter.
Ottawa.
Ottawa, Ontario. K2M as in mother.
K2N. Yep.
2 Tom 3. 2 T3.
Well, great. Hope you enjoy the books.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for attending today.
Yes.
Going well in Ottawa. Which shed are you
Yes. Well, I'm with the Central, and John Johnson is the chairman, but Kevin Ford is very active in the Ontario and I thought National Association. But Kevin Ford is one of our big players.
Yep.
But, anyway, we have a membership of 80 right now, and we kind of divided in 3 subgroups. The main one being what's called Ottawa Central.
Wow. Yes, that's almost like 3 sheds.
Well, it is in a way, and we say it one's central, but one's a maker shed, and in fact, Kevin is the prime on that maker shed, and they have equipment, and they help out actually in the community. They've done actually quite a couple of very interesting projects in the community, and the other 2 are just social. We're a large city, so we're kind of spread out a little bit. That's why we've divested a little bit.
Well, Kevin contributed a lot to Men's Sheds Canada in the first year, and I've always appreciated him. So
yeah, he's very active here. Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody there.
I will make sure you get the books. I'll order them and have them sent to your address.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for now. Bye for now.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye for
everyone.
now. Thank you.
I'm going to end the recording.